We're at the end of the first part of the in-text citations. Please don't think that I've covered everything. You'll need to go on and watch the lecture on the second part of in-text citations. Thank you. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to our lectures. Today in lecture number 7, I want to talk about the way you go about making in-text citations. In other words, citations that you'll put in your paper to tell where your resources, your sources come from as you're writing it. We'll later on get to your reference page, which is a list of the references that you've used in your paper. I've divided this topic up into 2 lectures just to make them a little less long. So this first one, I want to talk about some of the nuts and bolts having to do with APA style. APA style basically asks you to do 3 things. You give the author or author's last name or names, the year the journal or the book was published, and then if you make a direct quote, you need to give the page number or numbers. That is really the essence of what you do, and you're going to be doing this as you write at the end of sentences, at the end of paragraphs, and so on and so forth. Now, why is APA ask you to do this? Well, one of the things that's pretty important about APA style is that it forces you to do the best you possibly can to make sure that you are giving credit to others who you have gotten your information or argumentation or ideas from. So it certainly gives us an opportunity to be honest about where we've gotten our content. Secondly, it's a nice way to cite authority figures for the arguments you make. Clearly, when we write a paper, we're trying to convince often our readers that something is true or something is right. And so in some ways, citing publications written by prominent people in the field gives weight to our arguments. Thirdly, if your readers are interested, particularly in something you've said, they can quickly locate where this idea, this quote, this data came from. They simply look at your in-text, a paragraph or a sentence, and they see, you know, Trump 2016, and they can go look in your references and look up which journal article it was, which what's the name of the article, and so on and so forth. And lastly, APA style just wants to help its writers avoid plagiarism. In other words, even avoid unintentional plagiarism. If you're citing as you go, there is very, very little indication that you have purposefully or even mistakenly ripped off these ideas from somebody else. Now, what are the common sources? Well, here's a book that I wrote. You could cite a book. That's a common source, although not in the paper you're going to write for this class, because this class requires you to write a literature review paper, but certainly in some of your other classes you will cite books. Nowadays, probably the most popular source of my reading is website pages. I certainly read books, I read journal articles, but a lot of the journal articles, quite frankly, are on the internet, so pages from websites. And again, the one that's going to be very important to you for this class is academic journals. Peer-reviewed academic journals are what you're going to be required to use in your paper, and so clearly those are your 3 big sources. There are plenty of other sources. You could cite a film, you could cite a podcast, you can cite a lecture, you can cite any number of other things, and there's all kinds of ways to do that. They're relatively rare, but when you do cite those, if you ever do have a write a paper, I suggest that you go to some of the sources that we've put online here, especially the OWL Purdue for all those extremely rare ways of citing. But for our purposes in learning APA style in this class, basic class, books, websites, and journal articles are really going to account for 99.9% of your citations. So here we have a journal article from the journal called Technology in Healthcare, and you can see our authors there, all from Korea. And while this is not a psychology article, it certainly uses some modified APA style. Now, I want to begin talking about the in-text citations when we're engaging in a direct quote. So imagine that this is the direct quote that we want to use in our paper. This case study showed that the dominant upper back pain decreased after RSP decreased through the application of RST by using kinesiology tape in a female sedentary worker. So that's our quote. How are we going to go about making sure we cite that from APA style? Well, here's certainly one way to do it. We could start the sentence off by saying Hangbo, Lee, and Kim, and then in parentheses put the year. Discovered quote marks, you can see there, dominant upper back pain, blah, 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 and then quote marks ending the quote. So you can see that we have the author's name, year, and we want to add the page number. This was on one page, so essentially what we do is we put a parentheses, small p, period, space, then the number of the page, close parentheses, and the period. This is the way we do a direct quote in which we're including the author's name in the narrative. Now, if we wanted to cite at the end of the quote, we might, instead of using their names at the beginning of the quote, this is called quoting parenthetically. Researchers discovered blah, blah, blah. Well, researchers discovered that, quote, dominant upper, so on and so forth, and then end quote. Then open parentheses, the author's names, comma, space, the year, comma, space, p, period, space, the page number, close quote, and the period. This would be how we cite at the end of the sentence. So there's two real ways of citing. The first one, which was our earlier one, is we use the author's author's name in the narrative. Then simply what we do is we follow that by the year and we put, yes, the page number right at the end. If we want to not use the author's articles, but just call them researchers, what we would have to do is at the end of the quote, cite their names, the year, and then the page number. I hope that's clear. So just to reiterate this, quoted works must specify always the page numbers in the source that you got it, okay? So if you get a quote from a journal, from a book, from a web page, it's the source that you got it. So let's say that we had a quote, look, it's you guys. The four of you wrote this paper. I didn't even know that. Oh, that's weird. But let's say that this is a long quote and the very end of the quote is get an A in this course. Woohoo! Gilo, Isenko, Late, and Park, I hope I pronounced your names right, comma 2018, comma page 44. Or again, if you wanted to cite the other authors, look, there's other three of you, Parecki, Philip, and Sobro. That's weird. I can't believe the coincidence that you guys showed up in these quotes. That's awesome. Anyway, we have never taken such an interesting and useful class as this one. The three of you wrote in your book about this class. Parecki, Philip, Sebro, comma 2018. And now, if this quote is over 2 pages, what you have to do is don't use just P period. You have to use P period, space, 333, or whatever the page number is, and then a dash, and then the next page number. Did you get the difference between those two? So it's not only the way of quoting, but we have to point out the differences in how we use, how we cite the pages, if we have one page that we're quoting, or if our quote happens to go over two or more pages. I can't imagine it would go over more than two. Now, let's talk about the way we engage in in-text quoting. Whenever your source has one author or two authors, okay, you always cite all of the authors. So to give you an example here, if we were using the names of our authors in the narrative, Smith 2001 said something, blah, blah, blah. Smith and Jones 1980 examined. So that's always true. It's true of the first time you cite them, the second time you cite them, the third time you cite them, up until the millionth time you cite them. With one or two authors, the authors' last names are always cited. Here's another example using the parenthetical way of citing. Applicants' expectations are outlandish. And again, Smith, comma, 2001. Or applications expectations are outlandish. Smith and Jones, 1980. So you'll notice there that there's a change when we quote, when we make a citation, if we're doing it in the narrative. So if you looked right up here, when we're using it in the narrative, it's Smith and, A-N-D, Jones. When we're citing two or more authors parenthetically, it would be Smith, and you can see we don't write the word and. Rather, we use this little thing which is called an ampersand, Smith and Jones. And I'll reinforce that here in a second. So, oh, this is what I just said, so let me just reinforce that. Smith and Jones when we're writing. Sorry about that. And clearly, if we're citing them parenthetically, it would be Smith ampersand Jones. It's one of the most common mistakes that students make is they write Smith and A-N-D Jones within parentheses, or sometimes even when they're writing with the author's names as part of the narrative, they'll use the ampersand where they should be using the and here. Now, when we use, just let me repeat, when we have one or two authors, we're always going to cite their names first to a millionth time they appear in our paper. That is not true when you have 3, 4, or 5 authors in your article or book or web page. What we do with 3, 4, or 5 authors is a little bit different. The first time you cite them in your paper, you put all of their last names. So again, first example here is if we were using their names in the narrative, it would go Wiley, Smith, and, remember, don't forget, here we're using and Jones, and 2015. But when we cite them the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh time, we're not going to do this. So here's just another example. Most left-handers are artistic, and we have Wiley, Smith, and Jones. The next time, subsequent references, we use et al., which is Latin for and others. The all is abbreviated. So here would be an example, Wiley et al. 2015, when you were using the author's name in the narrative, state scary movies, blah, blah, blah. And if we were citing parenthetically, scary movies affect left-handers more than right-handers, Wiley et al. Do not forget when you use et al., there is no period after et. Okay, it's a full word, and. But since al is a abbreviation, there's always a period there. When you cite it parenthetically, Wiley et al. Period, comma, space 2015. Now again, if you were doing a direct quote here, if this was a direct quote, scary movies, it'd be Wiley et al. Period, comma, the year, comma, P period space, and say. Here's another example for 3 to 5 authors. Again, the first citation, if we were using the author's name in the narrative, Hummel, Cake, Whatley, and Manetti, 2004, or again, if we were using the parenthetic method of citation, Hummel, Cake, Whatley, and Manetti, 2004, all within quotes. The later citation for the first one would just be Hummel et al., 1994, and for the parenthetic citation, Hummel et al., 1994, in quotes. Now, when there's 6 or more authors, it gets easy once again. We simply start with the first author's name, and that is followed by the et al. That we talked about before, and then the year. Again, some examples of 6 or more authors in their provocative paper. Smith et al. 2005 point out, and then the parenthetic citation, the authors, in parentheses, Smith et al. 2005. So for 6 or more authors from the first citation all the way to the very last one, we simply use the first author's name and then et al. So just to review here, when we have 1 or 2 authors, we always cite the names and the year. When we have 3 to 5 authors, we cite the names followed by the year the first time a citation made is made in your paper, and then in second and subsequent citations, we simply use the first name of the author followed by et al. For 6 or more authors, from the very first citation on, we simply use the first author's last name and then et al. I hope that makes sense. Now, when there's no author named, sometimes there'll be an article online and you can't find any author. What we simply do is we use a shortened title of the work, 1 or 2 or 3 words, the beginning words usually of the article, and simply put that in quotes as the title of the article, and it is followed by the year of publication. So kinesiology tape helps with shoulder pain. If it was efficacy of RPT for shoulder pain, it would just be efficacy 2013. Or biblical psychology has been instrumental in challenging Christians to integrate real life with scripture. And then again, we would use Does the Bible 2017 if the title was something like Does the Bible have anything to say to Christians about integrating real life with scripture. So no author named, we just again take 1, 2, or 3 words, usually the first couple of words, 3 words of the article, and then it's followed by the year. Now, sometimes we have a single citation in which we want to cite more than one article. We may be generalizing. We may say something like past researchers have found, and then we want to cite 3 or 4 past researchers in different articles. Or in the example I gave you here, the use of medications such as Ritalin is becoming increasingly common. And he gives 3 different articles here. The way we cite them is alphabetically. We always begin with the first the author's first name that comes first in the the author's last name that comes first in the alphabet. So in this case, it would be Barr, comma 1983, followed by a semicolon. James and Allen, 1991, followed by a semicolon. And in this particular case, Smith et al., this may be Smith and 9 authors, 1989. So when we want to put multiple journal articles or books or whatever in a single citation because we're generalizing, remember the rule is place them alphabetically and at the end of the sentence or the paragraph, and that would give you a correct citation. We're at the end of the first part of the in-text citations. Please don't think that I've covered everything. You'll need to go on and watch the lecture on the second part of in-text citations. Thank you.